The high desert wind carried more than just sand and the scent of sage. It whispered tales of desperation and survival. For Valerie Reed, a woman who had traded the soot-stained skies of Boston for the relentless blue of the Arizona Territory, it was a wind of change. She'd come west with a contract in her hand and a prayer on her lips, a mail-order bride promised to a man she'd never met. But the vows she was prepared to make were not the only ones that would bind her to this harsh, beautiful land. In a hail of gunfire and a clash of two worlds, her fate would be sealed not by a wedding band, but by the selfless act of a man considered her enemy. This is the story of that choice, and the lives it irrevocably altered. The stagecoach, a bone-jarring vessel of splintered wood and faded paint, finally crested the last rise. Below, nestled in the vast, sun-scorched expanse of the Arizona Territory, lay the town of Redemption. From a distance, it was a mere smudge against the fiery backdrop of the setting sun, a collection of low-slung buildings that seemed to cower before the immense, indifferent landscape. For Valerie Reed, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, it was the end of one life and the beginning of another. She clutched the worn leather of her reticule, her knuckles white. Inside, alongside a few precious mementos from a life she had purposefully left behind, was the photograph of Mr. Silas Croft. In the stiffly posed image, he was a man of stern countenance, his gaze direct, his jaw set, with a determination that hinted at a man who had carved his existence from this unforgiving land. His letters had been brief, businesslike, yet they had offered something she craved more than poetry or charm security. The daughter of a Boston dockworker, Valerie had known little else but hardship. The damp chill of their small apartment, the constant cough that had finally stolen her mother the meager meals. It was a life of quiet desperation. When the advertisement for a mail-order bride had appeared in the paper, it had felt like a lifeline thrown into a churning sea. A chance not for riches, but for a home, a family, and the simple dignity of not having to wonder where her next meal would come from. As the stagecoach rattled down the dusty main street, Valerie peered out her initial apprehension, warring with a flicker of hope. Redemption was a raw, untamed place. Saloons, their bat-wing doors, swinging lazily, spilled forth a cacophony of boisterous laughter and tinny piano music. Cowboys, their faces weathered, and their spurs jingling, ambled along the boardwalks, their gazes lingering on her with an unnerving intensity. The air hung thick with the smells of dust, sweat, and something else, a tension that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface of the town's boisterous energy. A small crowd had gathered to witness the stagecoach's arrival, a momentary diversion in the monotonous rhythm of their lives. Valerie's gaze swept over them, searching for the face from the photograph. When she finally saw him, her breath caught in her throat. Silas Croft was older than his picture suggested. The lines around his eyes were deeper. His shoulders stooped with a weariness that the photograph had failed to capture. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled her. They were a pale, washed-out blue, and they held a coldness that seemed to extinguish the desert sun. He stepped forward as the driver opened the coach door, his movements stiff and proprietary. "Miss Reed," he inquired, his voice a low grumble that was more of a statement than a question. Valerie, gathering her courage, nodded and allowed him to help her down. His grip on her arm was firm, possessory. "Mr. Croft," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you." "The pleasure is all mine," he said, though his tone was devoid of any genuine warmth. He gestured curtly to a young boy who was already wresting her trunk from the back of the coach. "This is my home now, Miss Reed. You will find it adequate. His home, a small clapboard house at the edge of town, was indeed adequate, if starkly furnished. There were no feminine touches, no softness to blunt the harsh angles of the place. It was the dwelling of a man who saw life not as something to be enjoyed, but as something to be endured. Over a meagre supper of beans and salted pork, Silas laid out the terms of their arrangement with the same dispassionate tone he might have used to discuss the price of cattle. "We'll be married by the circuit judge at the end of the week," he announced, not looking at her. "I expect a clean house, hot meals, and obedience. In return, you will have a roof over your head and my protection." Valerie, her appetite gone, could only nod. This was not the partnership she had naively envisioned, but it was the bargain she had made. She would be a good wife. She would earn her keep. In the days that followed, Valerie threw herself into her new role with a desperate energy. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. She coaxed a small garden from the reluctant soil, and she learned to navigate the town's small but complex social landscape. She discovered that Silas Croft was a man respected for his wealth. He owned the town's mercantile, but not necessarily liked. He was a hard man in his dealings, quick to anger and slow to forgive. The women of the town, for their part, regarded her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They were a tight-lipped, resilient bunch, their faces etched with the hardships of frontier life. They offered her no friendship, only polite, distant nods. Valerie was an outsider, a woman who had bought her place in their society, and they would not let her forget it. It was during one of her trips to the mercantile to procure supplies that she first saw him. He was standing in the shadows of the covered walkway, his presence a stark contrast to the boisterous cowboys and bustling townsfolk. He was Apache, that much was clear from his high cheekbones, the long, dark hair held back by a simple leather band, and the quiet intensity of his gaze. He wore the simple cotton shirt and trousers of a scout, but he carried himself with an air of quiet dignity that set him apart. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and Valerie felt a jolt that had nothing to do with the desert heat. His eyes were the color of dark, rich earth, and in their depths she saw not the savagery she had been taught to expect, but a profound sadness, a wisdom that seemed as old as the mountains that loomed on the horizon. He was gone as quickly as he had appeared, melting back into the shadows. But the memory of his gaze lingered with her, a disquieting counterpoint to the cold reality of her life with Silas. The whispers about the Apache were a constant undercurrent in redemption. They were a people displaced, their lands encroached upon by the relentless Eskimo or white settlement. There was a fragile peace, a truce born of necessity, but it was a peace that felt as brittle as sun-dried leaves. The local ranchers' men like Jedediah Kane, a burly, blustering man with a swagger that bordered on belligerence, spoke of the Apache with a venom that chilled Valerie to the bone. "They're thieves and murderers." The lot of them, Kane had declared one evening in the mercantile, his voice loud enough for all to hear. The only good Apache is a dead Apache. Silas had merely nodded in agreement, his face a mask of grim approval. Valerie, standing behind the counter, had felt a wave of nausea. This was the world she had chosen, a world where hatred was as common as the dust that coated everything. Her wedding day dawned bright and cloudless, the sky a vast, indifferent canvas. Valerie stood before the small mirror in her room, dressed in a simple gown she had sewn herself. She was pale, her eyes large and haunted in her thin face. This was the culmination of her journey, the moment she was to become Mrs. Silas Croft. But as she stared at her reflection, she felt not a flicker of joy, only a profound and suffocating dread. The ceremony was a brief, perfunctory affair, held in the town's small, stuffy courthouse. The circuit judge, a man with a perpetually bored expression, rattled off the words with a practiced monotony. Silas's responses were crisp and clear. Valerie's were barely audible. As the judge pronounced them man and wife, Silas turned to her. He did not kiss her. He simply took her arm, his grip once again, possessory. "It is done," he said, his voice flat. "Let us go home." The walk back to the house was a silent one. The townsfolk who had witnessed the ceremony watched them go, their expressions unreadable. Valerie felt like a prize sow, being led to a new pen, her future as bleak and unyielding as the desert landscape that surrounded her. That night, she learned the true extent of Silas's coldness. He was not a brutal man, not in the way Jedediah Cain might have been. But his touch was devoid of tenderness, his actions mechanical and detached. He took what he had paid for, and when he was done, he rolled over and fell asleep, leaving Valerie to lie awake in the darkness, a silent scream trapped in her throat. In the weeks that followed, Valerie settled into a routine of quiet servitude. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended to her small garden, and she endured Silas's nightly attentions with a stoicism born of despair. She was a ghost in her own life, a silent observer of her own slow demise. Her only moments of respite came from her solitary walks at the edge of town, near a small, winding creek that was one of the few sources of life in this arid land. It was there, amidst the rustling cottonwoods and the gentle murmur of the water, that she could almost forget the cold emptiness of her marriage. It was during one of these walks that she saw him again, the Apache scout. He was crouched by the water's edge, his back to her, seemingly lost in contemplation. She should have turned back, she knew. A respectable married woman had no business being alone with an Apache. But something held her there, a curiosity that was stronger than her fear. As if sensing her presence, he turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers across the short distance. He did not seem surprised to see her. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. Gathering her courage, Valerie took a tentative step forward. "Hello," she said, her voice soft. He did not reply, but he did not move away. He simply continued to watch her, his gaze steady and unwavering. Emboldened by his silence, she took another step. I am Valerie Croft." A flicker of something, recognition, crossed his face. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, his height surprising her. He was taller than Silas, his frame lean and powerful. "I know who you are," he said, his voice a low melodic rumble that seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath her feet. "And you are?" she prompted, her heart beating a little faster. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her worthiness to know his name. Then he said, "I am called Goyathle." But the white eyes, "They call me Geronimo." The name struck her like a physical blow. Geronimo. The name whispered in fear around campfires, the name that had become synonymous with Apache resistance, with bloodshed and terror. This was the man Jedediah Cain and his ilk wanted to see hanging from a rope. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her curiosity. She took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. Goyathle's expression softened, a hint of sadness touching his eyes. "You have been taught to fear my name," he said, his voice gentle. "But a name is only a sound. It is the man you should judge." Before Valerie could respond, The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the stillness. It was Silas, his face a thundercloud of fury. "Valerie!" he roared, his voice cracking like a whip. "What in God's name are you doing?" He slid from his horse, his face contorted with a rage that was terrifying to behold. He strode towards her, his hand raised as if to strike her. But before he could reach her, Goyathlai moved with a speed that was almost blinding. He was suddenly between them, a silent, immovable presence. He did not touch Silas, did not even speak. He simply stood there, his body a shield, his dark eyes boring into Silas with an intensity that made the older man falter. Silas, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart. He looked from Goyathlai to Valerie, his face a mask of impotent rage. "Get in the house," he snarled at her, his voice trembling. "We will discuss this later." Valerie, her body shaking, turned and fled, not daring to look back. But as she ran, she could feel Goyathlai's gaze on her, a gaze that was no longer unreadable. It was a gaze of pity, of understanding, and something else, something that she dared not name. That night, Silas was not cold and detached. He was furious, his anger a poison that he poured out on her in a torrent of bitter accusations and threats. He did not strike her, but his words were like blows, each one chipping away at her already fragile spirit. "You have shamed me, woman," he hissed, his face close to hers. "You have consorted with a savage, a murderer. You are no better than a whore." Valerie endured it all in silence, her spirit retreating to a place deep inside where his words could not reach. But as she lay in the darkness, long after he had fallen into a fitful sleep, she could not erase the image of Goyathlai from her mind. He had shielded her, had stood between her and her husband's wrath. A man her people called a savage had shown her more kindness and protection than the man who had sworn to do so before God. The incident by the creek was a turning point. It had shattered the fragile peace of her existence and had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to a confrontation far more deadly than a husband's anger. The Crossfire was coming, and Valerie Reed, the mail-order bride from Boston, was about to be caught in its deadly embrace. The weeks following the encounter at the creek were fraught with a suffocating tension. Silas watched Valerie with a hawk's eye, his suspicion a palpable presence in their small, silent house. Her walks were forbidden, her movements restricted to the confines of their property and the well-trodden path to the mercantile. She was a prisoner in her own home, the dream of a new life having curdled into a nightmare of servitude and fear. But Silas's anger was a slow-burning fire, and it sought other outlets as well. His already harsh dealings with the townspeople grew even more severe. He foreclosed on a small rancher, who was a week late with his payment, leaving the man and his family with nothing but the clothes on their backs. He publicly berated a young mother whose child had accidentally knocked over a display of canned goods in the mercantile. His cruelty, once a private affair reserved for Valerie, was now on public display, and the resentment against him in redemption began to fester. Jedediah Kane, the boisterous rancher, was a frequent visitor to the mercantile, his presence always a harbinger of trouble. He and his coterie of like-minded men would gather around the pot-bellied stove, their voices low and conspiratorial, their talk always circling back to the Apache problem. "They're getting bolder," Kane declared one afternoon, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the spittoon with a satisfying sizzle. "Saw one of their scouts near my land just the other day. Watching. Always watching. Silas, wiping down the counter with a dirty rag, nodded in agreement. "It's Geronimo's band," he said, his voice laced with a venom that made Valerie's blood run cold. "They're the worst of the lot. He's a devil, that one." Valerie, arranging tins of peaches on a shelf, pretended not to listen, but her ears strained to catch every word. She knew they were talking about Goyathle. The name Geronimo was a curse on their lips, a symbol of everything they feared and hated. But to her, it was the name of the man who had stood between her and her husband's rage, the man whose eyes held not savagery, but a deep and abiding sorrow. She had not seen Goyathle since that day at the creek, but his presence lingered in her thoughts, a silent counterpoint to the ugliness that surrounded her. She found herself searching for him in the crowds, her gaze scanning the distant mazes in the vain hope of catching a glimpse of a lone rider. The tension in the town was a tinderbox, waiting for a spark, and that spark came in the form of a stolen horse. It was one of Cain's prize stallions, a magnificent beast that was the envy of every rancher in the territory. Cain, his face purple with rage, stormed into the mercantile, a posse of armed men at his back. It was the Apache, he roared, slamming his fist on the counter so hard that the tins of peaches rattled on their shelves. "I saw the tracks. They're mocking us, stealing from under our very noses, Silas." His eyes, gleaming with a cold fire, was quick to fuel the flames. "I've warned you, Jedediah," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I've told you that we need to take matters into our own hands. The army is useless. They're more interested in treaties than in protecting honest, hard-working folk." "Well, I've had enough of treaties," Cain spat. "I'm riding out, and I'm not coming back until I've got my horse and a few Apache scalps to go with it." A cheer went up from the men assembled, a guttural roar of approval. Valerie, her heart pounding in her chest, watched in horror as the seeds of violence so carefully sown began to sprout. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was not about a stolen horse. It was about land, about hatred, about a clash of two worlds that could only end in bloodshed. And she knew with that same chilling certainty that Goyathle and his people would be the ones to pay the price. That evening, as Cain and his posse rode out of town, their whoops and hollers echoing in the twilight, a desperate plan began to form in Valerie's mind. It was a foolish, reckless plan, a plan that could get her killed. But the alternative, to do nothing to stand by while innocent people were slaughtered, was unthinkable. She waited until Silas was asleep, his snores filling the small house with a rhythmic grating sound. Then she slipped out of bed, her movements as silent as a cat's. She dressed quickly in the darkness, her hands trembling so badly that she could barely fasten the buttons on her dress. She scribbled a hasty note to Silas, a lie about a sick friend in a neighboring town, a flimsy excuse that she knew he would not believe. But it didn't matter. By the time he found it, she would be long gone. She crept out of the house and made her way to the livery stable, her heart in her mouth. The stable boy, a lanky youth named Billy, was asleep in the hayloft. She saddled one of Silas's horses, her hands clumsy in her haste. She had ridden a few times as a girl, but she was by no means an accomplished horsewoman. As she led the horse out of the stable, a voice from the shadows startled her so badly that she almost cried out. "And where might you be going, Mrs. Croft?" It was the town doctor, a man named Elias Thorne. He was a kind gentleman, with weary eyes that had seen too much of death and suffering. He was one of the few people in Redemption who had shown her any genuine kindness. "Valerie." Her voice, trembling, could not bring herself to lie to him. I have to warn them." She whispered her words barely audible. Dr. Thorne's expression was one of profound sadness. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I thought as much," he said. "You have a good heart, Valerie. A rare commodity in these parts." He stepped forward and pressed a small leather pouch into her hand. "It's not much," he said. "Some dried meat, a little water. And this." He showed her a small, single-shot derringer. "I hope to God you don't have to use it." Tears welled in Valerie's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Go," he said, his voice gentle, "and may God go with you." She rode out of redemption under the cover of darkness, a lone, determined figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. She did not know exactly where she was going, only that she had to find Goyathlai and his people before Cain and his posse did. She followed the tracks of Cain's men, a wide, easy trail to follow. The desert at night was a strange and alien world. The familiar landmarks of the day were transformed into dark, menacing shapes. The air was filled with the sounds of unseen creatures, the hoot of an owl, the yip of a coyote. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach, but her determination was stronger than her fear. She thought of Goyathlai's sad, wise eyes, and she spurred her horse onward. She rode for what seemed like an eternity, the rhythmic plodding of the horse's hooves, a hypnotic drumbeat in the silence of the night. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, offered little light. She was lost, a tiny, insignificant speck in the vastness of the desert, just as despair was beginning to set in. She saw it, the faint flicker of a campfire in the distance. Hope, sharp and sudden, surged through her. She urged her horse forward, her exhaustion forgotten. As she drew closer, she could hear the sounds of men's voices, rough and angry. It was Cain's posse. They had made camp for the night. She dismounted, her legs shaky and unsure, and crept forward on foot, her heart pounding against her ribs. She hid behind a cluster of rocks, her vantage point, offering a clear view of the camp. Cain and his men were gathered around the fire, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. They were drinking whiskey, their voices growing louder and more belligerent with each swallow. Their talk was of killing of scalps, of the brutal vengeance they would exact on the Apache. "We'll wipe them out," Cain boasted, his words slurred. "Every last man, woman and child. We'll teach them a lesson they'll never forget." A wave of nausea washed over Valerie. These were not men seeking justice. They were a lynch mob fueled by hatred and whiskey. She knew she had to get past them to find Goyathlai before they did. She waited until their drunken revelry had reached its peak, until their senses were dulled by alcohol. Then, taking a deep breath, she began to move, circling wide around the camp. Her body pressed low to the ground, every nerve endings screaming in protest. It was a slow, agonizing process. Every snap of a twig, every dislodged pebble sounded like a gunshot in the silence. But she kept going, driven by a force she did not understand. She had almost made it past the camp when a hand suddenly clamped down on her shoulder. A scream died in her throat as she was spun around, her face illuminated by the light of a lantern. It was one of Cain's men, a hulking brute with a pock-marked face and small, piggish eyes. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face as he recognized her. "Well, well, well," he sneered, his breath hot and foul. "Look what we have here. The Apache lover herself." He began to drag her towards the fire, his grip like a vice on her arm. "Look what I found, boys," he shouted, his voice triumphant. Silas Croft's pretty little wife out for a midnight stroll. The men around the fire turned their faces a mixture of surprise and drunken lust. Cain, his eyes blazing with a malevolent glee, rose to his feet. So he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "The little bird has flown her cage. Come to warn your savage friends. Have you, Valerie?" Her body, rigid with terror, did not answer. She could only stare at the faces of the men who surrounded her, their expressions a terrifying mask of hatred and cruelty. She was trapped, her desperate gamble having ended in disaster. Just as Cain reached for her, a sudden piercing cry echoed through the night, a sound that was both chilling and strangely beautiful. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very soul of the desert, a sound that spoke of defense and ancient power. Every man in the camp froze their heads, snapping up their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. And then, as if from the very earth itself, they appeared. Dark, silent figures on horseback, their forms silhouetted against the moonlit sky. They were the Apache, and they had come not for a stolen horse, but for a reckoning. At their head, mounted on a magnificent war pony, was Goyathli. His face was a mask of grim determination, his dark eyes blazing with a righteous fury. He was no longer the sad, quiet scout from the creek. He was a warrior, a leader of his people, and he had come to answer the challenge that had been thrown at his feet. The crossfire, the one Valerie had so desperately tried to prevent, had finally come. And she was standing in the very heart of it. The world erupted in a maelstrom of chaos and violence. The night moments before, filled with the drunken taunts of Cain's men, was now shattered by the terrifying symphony of war, the sharp crack of rifles, the guttural war cries of the Apache, the screams of wounded men. Valerie was thrown to the ground in the initial confusion, the hulking brute who had captured her, releasing his grip as he fumbled for his own weapon. She scrambled backwards on her hands and knees, her mind a maelstrom of terror, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling her nostrils. The fight was a brutal close-quarters affair. Cain and his men, caught completely by surprise, were at a disadvantage. But they were seasoned fighters, their initial shock quickly replaced by a desperate, cornered animal ferocity. They took cover behind their saddles and wagons, their rifles spitting fire into the darkness. The Apache, in contrast, moved with a fluid, ghost-like grace. They were a part of the night, their dark forms melting into the shadows, their arrows finding their marks with a deadly, silent precision. They were not a disorganized mob. They were a disciplined fighting force, their movements coordinated and precise. Valerie, huddled behind a large boulder, could only watch in horror as the brutal ballet of death unfolded before her. She saw men she recognized from Redemption, men who had tipped their hats to her on the street fall, with arrows in their chests, their lives extinguished in an instant. She saw Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, cut down by rifle fire, their war cries silenced forever. This was not the romanticized violence of the dime novels she had read back in Boston. This was real, it was ugly, and it was utterly devastatingly final. Her gaze was drawn again and again to Goyathli. He was everywhere at once, a whirlwind of controlled fury. He fought not with a rifle, but with a traditional war club and a long, sharp knife. He moved with a dancer's grace, his body a blur of motion, his every strike precise and deadly. He was not a savage, not a devil. He was a man defending his people, his land, his very existence. In the midst of the chaos, Valerie's eyes met those of Jedediah Kane. He was crouched behind an overturned wagon, his face a mask of rage and fear. He raised his rifle, and for a terrifying moment, Valerie thought he was aiming at her. But his target was not her. It was Goyathle. A scream tore from Valerie's throat, a wordless cry of warning. "Goyathle!" He heard her. He turned his eyes, finding hers for a fleeting second. In that instant, she saw not the fury of a warrior, but the sad, wise eyes of the man she had met at the creek. The rifle cracked, the sound deafeningly loud. Goyathle staggered, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. But he did not fall. He simply gritted his teeth, his face a mask of pain and determination. Kane, seeing his shot, had not been fatal, raised his rifle again this time, taking careful aim. He was going to finish the job. But before he could fire, something inside, Valerie snapped. The fear, the helplessness, the passive acceptance of her fate. It all fell away, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so powerful it was almost dizzying. She was no longer Valerie Reed, the timid mail-order bride from Boston. She was a woman who had seen too much, endured too much to stand by and watch another act of senseless violence. With a cry of her own, a cry that was half rage and half despair, she launched herself from behind the boulder and ran not away from the fight, but directly into it. She ran towards Kane, her only thought to stop him, to prevent him from taking another life. It was a suicidal act, a foolish, impulsive gesture. But in that moment, it was the only thing that made sense. Kane, his concentration broken by her sudden appearance, hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Goyathle needed. Despite his wound, he moved with a speed that was almost supernatural. He launched himself at Kane, the two men crashing to the ground in a tangle of flailing limbs. At the same time, another of Kane's men, seeing his leader in trouble, turned his attention to Valerie. He was a young man, barely more than a boy, his face pale with fear and excitement. He raised his pistol, his hand trembling. Valerie froze, her eyes wide, with the certain knowledge that she was about to die. She could see the flash of the muzzle, could almost feel the impact of the bullet. But the shot never came. A dark form moved in front of her, a shield of flesh and bone. It was Goyathle. He had seen her peril, had abandoned his fight with Kane to protect her. He grunted a low, guttural sound of pain as the bullet slammed into his back. He staggered, his body lurching forward, and for a moment Valerie thought he would fall. But he did not. He stood his ground, his body a bulwark between her and the man who had shot him. The young man with the pistol stared, his eyes wide, with a mixture of horror and disbelief. He had just shot the great Apache war chief, the man who was supposed to be a devil, a monster. But the man he saw before him was not a monster. He was a man who had just sacrificed himself to save the life of a white woman. The fight seemed to falter, the sounds of battle dying down as both sides witnessed the incredible scene. In that moment of stunned silence, Goyathle turned his head, his dark eyes meeting Valerie's. "Go," he whispered, his voice strained with pain. "Run!" But Valerie could not move. She was rooted to the spot, her mind unable to process what had just happened. This man, this savage her people so reviled, had taken a bullet for her. The moment was shattered by a roar of rage from Jedediah Kane. He had scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of fury. "Kill them all!" he screamed, his voice raw with hatred. "Don't let any of them escape." But his men no longer had the stomach for the fight. The sight of their leader about to be saved by the very man they had come to kill And then the sight of that same man taking a bullet for a white woman had shaken them to their core. The fight had gone out of them. The Apache, seeing their advantage, pressed their attack. But it was not a massacre. They were not interested in slaughter. They were interested in survival. They drove Kane's men back, forcing them into a disorganized retreat. Kane, realizing the battle was lost, turned and fled, his threats and curses lost in the wind. The young man who had shot Goyathlai dropped his pistol as if it were a venomous snake and ran after him, his face a pale mask of shame and terror. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The night was silent once more. The only sounds, the crackle of the dying fire and the soft moans of the wounded. Valerie rushed to Goyathlai's side as he finally sank to his knees, his strength failing him. "Goyathlai," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Why? Why did you do it?" He looked up at her, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "A man does what he must," he said, his voice weak. "It is the way." He collapsed, then his body slumping to the ground. The other Apache warriors gathered around him, their faces a mixture of concern and reverence. A medicine man, his face a road map of ancient wisdom, knelt beside him and began to chant his voice, a low, melodic hum. Valerie, her hands stained with the blood of the man who had saved her, could only watch a silent, heart-broken witness to the terrible, beautiful, and utterly incomprehensible events of the night. She had come to the desert seeking a new life, and she had found it, but not in the way she had ever imagined. She had been caught in a crossfire, and in the heart of that violence, she had discovered a truth that would change her forever. The world was not as simple as she had been taught. There was not just black and white, good and evil, savage and civilized. There was only the human heart in all its terrible, magnificent complexity. And in the heart of a man named Goyathlai, she had found a nobility that shamed the so-called civilization she had left behind. The desert dawn broke cold and grey, casting a pale, unforgiving light on the previous night's carnage. The air, thick with the scent of blood and gunpowder, was heavy with a somber silence, broken only by the low, rhythmic chanting of the Apache medicine man. Valerie had not moved from Goyathlai's side. She'd watched as the medicine man Noche de worked with ancient knowledge, his gnarled hands surprisingly gentle. He cleaned the wound with herbs and chanted. But his efforts were not enough. Goyathlai was alive, his breathing shallow, his face pale beneath his dark skin. The bullet was still lodged deep in his back, a leaden messenger of hate that Noche de's traditional tools could not remove. The other Apache warriors treated Valerie with a quiet, respectful distance. They had seen their leader shield this white woman with his own body. They did not understand it, but they respected his choice, and by extension, they respected her. A young warrior with kind, curious eyes brought her a water skin and some dried meat, which she accepted gratefully. As the sun climbed, a decision had to be made. They could not stay. Kane's men would surely return, and this time they would bring soldiers from Fort Grant. It was Noche de who spoke to her, his English halting but clear. He cannot ride. The journey to the stronghold will kill him. The stronghold, Valerie had heard the name whispered in Redemption, a secret fortress deep in the Dragoon Mountains. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice raspy with exhaustion. Noche de's ancient eyes met hers. "We will take him to a place of healing. But it is a hard journey, and he is weak." A desperate idea born of guilt and a fierce, newfound loyalty took root in Valerie's mind. "There is a doctor," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. In redemption. Dr. Thorne. He is a good man. He can help. He can take out the bullet. Noche de Ay considered her words, his expression unreadable. To take their leader to the white man's town, the very place that had spawned this hatred, was an unimaginable risk. But as he looked at Goyathlay, at the feverish glint in his eyes, he knew they had no other choice. This doctor, he said, his voice low. You trust him with the life of Goyathlay. Valerie did not hesitate. I trust him with my own. Thus a strange and unlikely procession set out across the desert. Goyathlay was carefully placed on a travois, pulled by a gentle pony. Valerie rode beside him, her hand resting on his, her heart a tangled knot of fear and hope. A small band of warriors led by Noche de Ay accompanied them, their faces grim. They avoided the main trails, moving with a stealth and silence that was unnerving, their passage as silent as the shadow of a cloud. Riding amongst these men, her people had taught her to fear. Valerie felt not apprehension, but a profound and unexpected sense of belonging. They reached the outskirts of redemption under the cloak of darkness. Noche de Ay and his warriors would go no further. To enter the town would be suicide. You will take him to this Dr. Thorne. Noche de Ay set his hand resting for a moment on Valerie's shoulder. Tell him the life of a great man is in his hands. And tell him that the people are watching. The unspoken threat was clear. If anything happened to Goyathlay, redemption would pay the price. With the help of the young warrior, Valerie managed to get Goyathlay onto her own horse. He was a dead weight, limp with fever. She mounted behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, his head lolling against her shoulder as she rode into the town she had once hoped to call home. She was no longer the respectable Mrs. Croft, but something else entirely, a woman who had crossed a line from which there was no return. She rode straight to Dr. Thorne's small adobe house and surgery, pounding on the door with raw fists. Dr. Thorne opened it, a lamp held high. His eyes widened when he saw her, and then the man she was holding. A look of profound and weary understanding crossed his face. Bring him in, he said, his voice calm and steady. Quickly. Together they half-carried, half-dragged Goyathlay onto the examining table. Dr. Thorne's examination was swift and efficient. The bullet is deep, he said grimly. The fever is high. I'll have to operate, but... He hesitated, his eyes meeting Valerie's. It's a risk. For him and for me. If anyone finds out he is here... They won't, Valerie said, her voice fierce. I won't let them. For the next few hours, the small surgery became a sanctuary. Dr. Thorne, with Valerie as his nurse, worked tirelessly. Valerie, who had once fainted at the sight of blood, now cleaned the wound, sterilized instruments, and held the lamp steady as the doctor probed for the bullet. She was no longer the frightened girl from Boston. She was a woman forged in the crucible of the desert. Finally, with a soft grunt of satisfaction, Dr. Thorne extracted the bullet, a misshapen piece of lead he dropped into a metal bowl with a sickening clink. The rest is up to him, he said, slumping with exhaustion. And to God. In the days that followed, Valerie did not leave Goyathlay's side. She bathed his fevered brow and spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, telling him stories of her childhood in Boston, of the sea, a world so different from his own. He was mostly delirious, speaking in his own language of mountains and eagles, of battles and lost loved ones, of a way of life that was vanishing like the morning mist. In his lucid moments, he would simply look at her, his dark eyes filled with a question he did not have to ask. Why? She had no answer she could put into words. She only knew that in saving him, she was somehow saving herself. The news of the disastrous raid had already reached Redemption. Kane and the few survivors straggled back their stories, a mix of half-truths and outright lies about a savage surprise attack. They spoke of overwhelming numbers, but not of their own drunkenness or cruelty. And they did not speak of Valerie. To admit she had tried to warn the Apache that their leader had taken a bullet for her, that was a truth too complex and shaming to acknowledge. Her role was erased from the official story. But Silas Croft knew. He knew Valerie had not gone to visit a sick friend. His silence was more terrifying than any accusation. He did not come looking for her. He did not ask after her. He simply waited his anger, a cold, patient poison. One evening as Valerie sat by Goyatle's bedside, he awoke. His eyes were clear and lucid for the first time. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady. "You have a strong heart. Inagant Jew," he said, his voice weak but clear. "What does that mean?" she whispered. "It means she who is brave," he replied. "It is a good name." Tears welled in Valerie's eyes. She had been called many things, but never a name that felt so true. "You must go," he said gently. "It is not safe for you here." "I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely. "You must," he insisted. "My people are watching. They will see that I am safe. But your husband, he is not a man to forgive. He will seek his own kind of vengeance." She knew he was right. She could not hide forever. The next day, while Goyathle slept a deep healing sleep, Valerie slipped out and walked back to the small clapboard house at the edge of town. She walked with her head high, her heart filled with a strange and unfamiliar courage. She was no longer afraid. She found Silas in the parlor, sitting in his armchair, with a rifle across his lap. He looked at her, his eyes as cold and dead as a winter sky. So he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "The whore returns." Valerie did not flinch. She met his gaze without fear. "I am not a whore, Silas," she said, her voice calm and steady. "And I am not your wife. Not anymore." She turned and walked away, leaving him there with his rifle and his hate. She did not know where she was going. She had no money, no friends, no place in this world. But for the first time in her life, she was free. As she walked out into the vast, beautiful and dangerous land that was now her home, she knew she would not be walking alone. The spirit of the man who had saved her, the man who had given her a new name, would be with her always. Valerie's steps, firm and resolute, led her back to the one place in Redemption that had offered sanctuary Dr. Thorne's surgery. She found him on his porch, his gaze fixed on the distant purple-hued mountains. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "He is gone," Dr. Thorne said quietly. "His people came for him before the dawn. They left this for you." He held out a small, intricately beaded pouch. Inside lay a single eagle feather, its tip a stark reddish-brown. "A sign of great honor," the doctor explained. "A symbol of courage." Clutching the feather, Valerie whispered, "What will I do now?" The freedom she had claimed now felt like a terrifying void. She was an outcast, a woman alone. "You will do what you must." Valerie Dr. Thorne said, his weary eyes kind. You have more strength than you know. You survived Boston, you survived Silas Croft, and you survived a night that would have broken most men. You will survive this. He offered her a room, a temporary haven. In return for his hospitality, Valerie became his assistant. Her hands, once soft, learned to mix poultices, bandage wounds, and comfort the sick. She saw the desperation behind the cowboy's bravado and the quiet resilience of the town's women, the grinding struggle for survival that united them all. She was now a pariah. The town's women who once pitied her now shunned her completely. She was the Apache lover, a woman who had betrayed her own kind. Yet small kindnesses were like beacons in the darkness. A bouquet of desert wildflowers left on the porch by Billy the stable boy. A ripe tomato pressed into her hand by a sympathetic Mexican woman in the market. One afternoon, a lone rider approached. It was the young Apache warrior with the kind eyes. He dismounted with fluid grace, his expression serious. I bring a message from Goyathlai, he said, his English more confident. He is well. He is strong. He asks for you. Valerie's heart leaped. He asks for me. He is at the stronghold. The warrior continued. He wishes to speak with you. He says you are in a Gantju. He says you have a place among the people if you will have it. The choice was a stark crossroads. Remain in this town that had rejected her, a ghost living a life of quiet servitude, or embrace the new name, the new identity forged in the Crossfire. She could cast her lot with the very people she was taught to fear. She looked at the young warrior, at his proud bearing, and thought of Goyathlai's wise eyes of the eagle feather. She kept close to her heart. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a destination. Tell him I will come, she said, her voice clear and strong. The journey to the stronghold was an arduous passage into a new world. Riding with the warrior whose name she learned was Taza. She learned the ways of the desert, to read the signs in the sand, to find hidden water, to understand the language of the wind. The stronghold wasn't a fort, but a natural fortress of rock and canyon, a place of breathtaking, impregnable beauty. As they rode into the hidden valley, she saw not savages, but a vibrant community. Women tanning hides their laughter echoing in the clear air, children playing with an innocence that defied their harsh lives, men whose faces held the wisdom of generations. And then she saw him. Goyathlai stood before a small wickiup, his arm in a sling, but his eyes bright and clear. A warm, genuine smile transformed his face as she approached. You have come in a Gantju, he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. I knew you would. In the weeks that followed, Valerie, now known only as Inagantju, began her new life. It was not easy. She had to learn a new language, new customs, a new way of seeing the world. But it was a life of purpose and belonging. She was no longer a possession to be bought and sold. She was a member of the people, valued for her courage, her compassion, and the strength of her heart. Her bond with Goyathlai was not one of passion, as her former world would define it, but a connection that ran deeper, forged in shared trauma and mutual respect. He was her teacher, protector, and friend. She, in turn, was his confidant, a link to the world that was relentlessly encroaching on his own. She knew the peace was fragile. The white world, with its insatiable hunger, would not leave them be. More battles, more sorrow lay ahead. But one evening, standing with Goyathlai on a high promontory, watching the sun set in a blaze of glory. She felt not fear, but a profound and abiding peace. Her life had been shattered and remade in the Crossfire. But in that crucible, she had found not just a new life, but a new self. She was Inagant Jew, she who is brave, and she was finally, truly home. The story of Valerie Reed, or Inagant Jew as she came to be known, is more than just a tale of the Wild West. It's a testament to the human spirit's ability to find courage in the face of fear and compassion in a world filled with hate. It reminds us that our true family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we find in the most unexpected of places. If her journey from the cobbled streets of Boston to the heart of the Apache Nation has moved you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who appreciate stories of resilience and the complex history of the American South. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true life dramas that bring the past to life. Your support helps us to continue telling these important stories. Thank you for listening.